that we've been here. So the cold weather is of little consequence to us. So this is just an example of where we come from, our way of saying thank you, where I come from. And I'd like to also acknowledge the people that made it possible for us to attend here. I'll probably leave a couple off, so I've got the main ones. The general structure of the talk, I'll do some introductory remarks about Cook Islands because probably most people never heard of them and certainly don't know where they are. And then comments on general vulnerability in the South Pacific and then specific impacts of climate change on the Cook Islands and what we're doing to adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change and some response measures. So here we are, we have a nice map there. The Polynesian Triangle stretches from Hawaii down to Easter Island in the east and New Zealand in the south. So it's quite a large triangle there. And here's the Cook Islands, just west of French Polynesia. We're right on the tropical. Some basic statistics, you can see we're quite spread out. There's a good 1,000 miles between the southernmost island and the northernmost. Different types of islands. These ones are atolls, so they're more vulnerable than the southern islands, which are generally volcanic or raised limestone coral. Our economy, we have 80,000 visitors per annum, a lot of them from Canada. So that's the main source of it. More than 50% of GDP is made up from tourism. Second one is pearl farming. Tourism is mostly in the southern islands. And pearl farming which is cultured pearls, mostly black pearls, takes place in the northern group. We have an Indigenous Leaders Forum which is recognised by the Constitution. I'll leave my uncle to explain further about that, but these are the basics. And we're very fortunate to be recognised and to be able to have some say over our governance. Into the general comments. This was given to me after the 2005 season. It just shows generally that there was some rather unusual events during 2005. That's the year of Hurricane Katrina, when the Caribbean had 5 hurricanes. We also, you can't see us, but we had 5. Cyclone Ingrid hit Australia, and that was a Category 5 hurricane. This was a headline from about 1989, which was regarded as alarmist. And these islands, the Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, Tokelau, Tuvalu, they're the most vulnerable ones in terms of sea level rise. I got this information from a New Zealand institute called the National Institute for Water and Atmosphere. So they have got data together which shows that surface ocean temperatures have increased during the 20th century and that warming has actually accelerated since the 1970s. Prior to that, there was general cooling, but one of the difficulties is that there's not much data from the southern hemisphere. However, if we follow what's gone on in the northern hemisphere, it's likely that the 1990s was the warmest ever. General impacts on the Pacific Islands affect the available water resources, agriculture. Of course, being islands, there's a lot of shoreline erosion and loss of land. There's healthy impacts because we get flooding or seawater encroachment, which creates disease. And then tourism, it impacts our main source of income, tourism. Every time we have a hurricane, the bookings fall off. And our biodiversity, which you're probably not surprised about. So I thought I would insert this from a presentation from our climate change coordinator, which just shows the general cycle of water from precipitation into snow, melt, which comes into the ocean, and then evaporates, goes back up into the clouds again. This is for a recent cyclone in the Philippines, so you get an idea of what they look like from the air. That was a Category 5, which did a lot of damage in the Philippines and Taiwan just last month. But the climate in the Pacific is ocean-driven. It's the largest body of water on the planet. So any heating changes the convection. And so when the sea temperature is heated to 28 degrees for 3 consecutive days or more, then the conditions arise for a hurricane. The La Nina effect, we have La Nina, El Nino. Within the El Nino, we get a lot more storms to the east, and the colder waters are near South America, where the Humboldt Current is, and the rest of the ocean heats up. So that is when we in the southwest and central Pacific will experience much more hurricanes and bad weather. In other years, La Nina years, you can see the body of water is much cooler, a larger body of cooler water, and the warmer waters move over towards Indonesia and the Arafura Sea. So we don't get so much in the way of storms. They're able to tell us this. Our hurricane season starts on the 1st of November. So usually towards the end of October, we get an indication of probability. Say the year in 2005, we had a 50% probability of getting hurricanes. So this kind of long-term prediction enables us to prepare ourselves. This is just one of the maps of the typical hand-drawn maps where you get an idea. That's Fiji there, that's Samoa, we're over here. And it's what's called the South Pacific Convergence Zone, where the different winds from the different directions, because we're right on the tropic where they meet and create some violent weather. Back to our island. This is our very small rock, which takes about 1 hour to drive around. But we're fortunate in that we're a high island and up to 2,000 feet. However, most of the population lives on the coastal plain here, down there, and the interior is impassable. You can see from the mountains set up that it's a volcanic caldera. So my ancestors apparently migrated from South China during the last big global warming, when parts of South China got submerged, and we ended up island hopping from one archipelago to another in search of a way through the mystical land. I wanted to show this to show how close to the fringing reef. This is our port, and this is the airport. So those really important infrastructure installations are very vulnerable to storm sea surges and sea level rise. This is one more typical of the other islands in the group. So you can see we have a very large fringing reef and a series of little islands in between it, and a very large amount of lagoon in the middle. So again, this particular island, I think, is about 4 meters above sea level around the coast, and it has one hill, only one hill. Another effect on the water is we have a freshwater lens under the island generally, but if you start tapping it, it ends up very similar to the plains from around like the Ogallala aquifer, where you take the freshwater out, which creates a change in pressure and results in saltwater intrusion. So you end up ruining your water resource if you take out too much. Bleaching of the corals in the fringing reef damages the barrier, which gives you protection against high seas. And the corals are susceptible to 2 degrees Celsius change in temperature. If they get warm, they start bleaching and then they die. Here we have one of the effects of longer dry periods, which are forecast for the next 20 years, interspersed with really severe weather events. On this particular occasion, we had about 8 inches of rain in the space of 12 hours. So this is one of our roads, and we were paddling up and down in canoes. Again, your freshwater supplies risk contamination, and you get insect-borne diseases because of the mosquito population explodes. We found that with long drought periods, this is our traditional crop. We eat a tuber called taro. That's what it should look like when it's nicely cultivated. But there's less water flowing down to the gardens, so you end up with gardens that have been cultivated hundreds of years that go lie fallow. The impacts on fishing, our traditional lunar calendar no longer fits. We have a 30-day lunar calendar, which I will talk more about later, but no longer fits the seasons. And there are seasonal migratory fish which made a welcome change to the diet, and they no longer arrive reliably because the currents have changed. This is the impact on our crafts and our medicines. They are more difficult, the materials are more difficult to find. I can see people nodding here because there are commonalities between us and continental Aboriginal people. So we have our own early warning signs, which my uncle will speak more about, but those are some of them. So they're based on observations over long periods of time. You know, when the bananas twirl in a certain way, you think, aha, we have to take advance precautions. And the most pressing one is when the frigatebirds circle the islands. They don't usually stay near the islands except in times of high wind. We also had food that we could eat in time of disaster, not very tasty, but we could survive on it. So we think that traditional leaders, we need to promote not only the traditional value system, but the traditional science, if you will, which enabled us to read the science and cope. So we need to create a good growing environment for traditional knowledge and then nurture it. Adaptation measures that we take, we can set buildings back further from the shore, return to living in the older sites in the valleys, plant the new salt-resistant, drought-resistant crops, raise buildings on supports. I didn't put in there's another one where you could put on those cyclone fixings. So for the cost of about $300, you much improve the safety of the roof on your house and harvest rainwater. Mitigation, we don't put out a lot of greenhouse gases, so our mitigation activities are fairly minimal. We can install solar energy for lighting, which has the benefit of saving the dependence on fossil fuels, compost garden waste, increase your energy efficiency, and particularly for the northern group, hydroponic cultivation of vegetables. This is what we do in response. We ask our regional neighbours for help, and they usually do help because they know they may be next on that. They may have it next time, then we'll offer them help. France is usually the first ones to arrive from Tahiti, which is only an hour away, and then usually New Zealand gets people of Cook Island descent living in New Zealand with expertise in water, electricity and telecommunications to come and assist with restoration, and then we usually get some funds from Australia as well. So what we like to do to ensure survival is to integrate traditional knowledge with modern technology. I know the last hurricanes we looked up a website called AccuWeather. One of the things we can do is provide accurate data to institutions like NOAA and NIWA, so that when we look at our websites, for the information that's up to date. And then to take care of the accelerated climate change that is being induced by human activities beyond our region. So this is one of the messages that I really want when we meet up in Ottawa. I want to emphasise that we're here to ask the larger countries, especially the corporations which produce the most of the greenhouse gases, and I want them to understand that we're feeling the impacts now, and they can do something to change it. We can change a little bit, but we can't change enough on our own. So thank you very much. I end with the traditional symbol of hope.
Thank you, Imogen. I neglected to mention earlier that was meant to join us was Mr. Arona Nari, who is the Director of Meteorological Services in the Cook Islands. And he was unable to join us due to last-minute complications. And Te Pāmatiopo, Imogen Ingram, graciously agreed to add some of the information that he had in his presentation into hers to give you some of the technical information about the Cook Islands. So our next presenter is Mona Bello, who is from the Arctic, Kalari, and Mona will begin the presentation now.
Good luck. My name is Mona Bello, and as Stephanie mentioned, I'm from the High Arctic. I'm from the territory of Nunavut, which is in orange here. More specifically from Iqaluit, where there's the red arrow. Iqaluit is now the capital of Nunavut, and it has become much larger ever since. I now live in Quebec City, where I earned a bachelor's degree from Université Laval, and I was also the president of the First Nations Student Council there. I also hold a Cégep diploma in tourism, and I have been involved in many initiatives where non-natives and natives can dialogue and learn more from each other. I was also the host of a radio show called Voix Autochtone, which in French means native voices. And in 2005, I had the immense privilege of living in New Zealand with a program called Indigenous Peoples Abroad program, which was a program that was created by Pacific Peoples Partnership. And I worked in New Zealand on promoting traditional waka tours, waka, which means the canoeing model. So I'll start my talk by presenting my people. My people was known as Eskimos for a long time, but we prefer the term Inuit as it is, as we have always referred ourselves as. The Inuit have lived in the Arctic for more than 4,000 years. It is thought that the Inuit crossed the Bering Strait just right here during the last climatic imbalance of the world, which was the Ice Age. Our ancestors followed mammoth herds, which show the very early dependency of the Inuit people on animals that surrounded them. We live in a land where agriculture is impracticable, and our dependency on hunting and fishing was and still is essential to our survival. The Inuit have always been very agile hunters, and we roamed the land in search of food. We were nomads up to about 50 years ago. Over the centuries, we developed an intimate knowledge of our environment, allowing us not only to survive, but to thrive in one of the world's harshest and most unforgiving climates. Today, there are 155,000 Inuit who live mostly in countries surrounding the North Pole. In Canada, 40,000 Inuit live in the Nunavut territory, which is in green. The Northwest Territories, in Quebec, in Newfoundland and Labrador. There are 24,000 Inuit that live in the state of Alaska, which is in orange on this map. 38,000 Inuit live in Greenland, which is in brown. And there is also an Inuit population in Siberia, Russia. We are a people of the Arctic, and the 155,000 Inuit of the world are represented by the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, organization for which Shilawat Kutsi worked for when she became world famous for being the voice of Inuit against global climate change. She has been nominated this year for the Nobel Peace Prize and has received many honors for her work in denouncing the effects of climate change on the Inuit people. And 2007-2008, for those who don't know, is International Polar Year, and the Inuit will most probably continue to be the main focus of the effects of climate change in the Canadian Arctic. The survival of the Inuit was based on how well we could adapt to such an isolated and inhospitable environment. Today, the Inuit are being forced to adapt again. The impacts of global warming on Inuit social and cultural well-being are monumental. The knowledge of our ancestors is in peril as the northern climate becomes much more unpredictable. Inuit now fear that their traditional knowledge might not be as reliable as it was before, and thus the lives of those who go out on the land for hunting and fishing is even more at risk. Climate change not only affects weather conditions, but also the food that we eat. Animal migration patterns have been disrupted, complicating the works of hunters who depend on traditional knowledge to find food sources. Hunters have also reported that the caribou population seems to be much smaller than it was before. Northerners are witnessing the arrival of new plant, insect, and animal species that were previously not found in the north. It is uncertain how these species will affect the delicate balance of the fragile northern ecosystem, and many are worried of the arrival of these new species. This is a very tangible sign that our environment and climate are changing. Why is it that the Inuit are seen as the barometer for climate change? It might have to do with the fact that the Inuit started living in communities, in fixed communities, only around the 1950s. Before that, we were nomads, like I mentioned earlier. Our traditional knowledge is fresh in the memory of our elders and still practiced today. Scientists have also noted that the effects of climate change will be felt more severely at the equator and the poles, and less so in temperate regions like Vancouver. The Inuit symbol of life on the tundra are therefore the first victims of climate change. It is for these reasons that Inuit have become one of the world's most vocal indigenous groups denouncing the effects of climate change. Climate change is just one example of how globalization is challenging the Inuit in the 21st century. No region, regardless of how remote, is immune to negative side effects such as pollution. Mercury and other toxins from industrial emissions in the south are carried up by prevailing winds. These toxins accumulate in fish, seal, and other animals and are slowly poisoning the Inuit people and other northerners, where much of the population still depends on wild food for survival. This slow intoxication of our food sources must be viewed as the disaster that it is. The health of a whole people is in peril, and this must be a concern for all the populations of the world. Climate change also has an influence on transportation. With the thawing of the Northwest Passage, which you see here in green, which is 7,000 kilometers shorter than the Panama Canal, comes increased pressure on Arctic people and ecosystems. The rapid growth in Asian manufacturing industries will see Canadian sovereignty over the North challenged, as this shortcut between Europe and Asia becomes more desirable to other nations. There is an urgent need to safeguard the Arctic from those who would exploit it without taking into consideration or involving the Inuit and others who live along this grand periphery, along the periphery of this grand passageway to Asia. The United States and Russian governments have claimed that Arctic waters are international waters and have continued to defy Canadian ownership on our land. And Nunavut, where I'm from, it's our land, so in our language, so it's pretty ironic. Our region was long seen as a desolate land where a very small population lived, but now international powers are starting to see the appeal of developing such a remote land. Globalization means we Inuit must look towards industrialization for job opportunities. Tourism is one possibility that remains very accessible for isolated communities. With the mythical Northwest Passage thawing for longer periods, the cruise ship industry is seen by some as a panacea for isolated communities who struggle to build a strong economic foundation. The Alaskan economy is an example of a northern region benefiting from its flourishing cruise industry. In fact, Alaska ranked 4th in cruise industry economic impacts in 2001. The cruise industry's total economic impact on Alaska was 1.7 billion in goods and services, over 14,000 jobs, and $470 million in salaries and wages. With these numbers would excite anyone who is struggling with a slow economy, but with the potential boost to a small community's economy comes consequences that may be undesirable to Inuit. If Canada chooses to develop its cruise industry, it will be important for the well-being of all that the Inuit culture is valued and the environment respected. Climate change not only affects the Inuit, but it also affects the animals that surround us. With the ice pack thawed out during longer periods during the year, one of our most mythical animals is gravely endangered. The World Wildlife Fund highlights that 25% of Arctic sea ice has already disappeared in the last 30 years, posing serious threats to polar bears. The polar bear feeds mainly on seals that lay on the ice pack during the winter. This is a very effective means of hunting, and it enables the polar bear to accumulate enough fat to survive the summer, where hunting for its food is much more difficult. With the season where the water is covered with ice being much shorter, polar bears find themselves skinny and hungry, and therefore approaching communities in search of food in dumpsters. This is very worrisome because the polar bear is a very dangerous animal, and that this could put the security of many people in danger. The fact that the polar bear is not building enough fat to last the summer also affects its reproductive cycle, and fewer cubs are born each year, and so the polar bear population is declining. But the polar bear is just one example of the effects of climate change on the animals on which Inuit are dependent. Warming temperatures associated with climate change also have a potentially disastrous effect on the permafrost. And you see here, permafrost is known as soil or rock that remains under 0 degrees Celsius throughout the year. Thawing of this very stable foundation causes structures to break and to need major repairs. This will require that we make important changes in the way we build our houses and public buildings. So in conclusion, climate change and increasing globalization present major challenges for the Inuit. It is therefore vitally important that we deepen our understanding of their effects on the Arctic and on the rest of the planet. We must adapt to new realities and find tangible ways for aspects of our culture to survive in a rapidly changing environment where traditional knowledge is also forced to adapt. The stakes could not be higher as the well-being of future generations of Inuit hang in the balance. My people has understood a very long time ago what sustainable development means. That human beings are part of a greater whole that is the world, that we cohabit with nature, animals, and insects, and that every single element has an influence on the other elements of the world. We have also understood that if we treat everything that surrounds us with respect, it will give us back that respect. It is now time for everybody around the world to come to the same understanding.
Thank you, Mona. So now this morning we've heard from our visitor from the South Pacific, and we've heard from our visitor from the Arctic. I think it's time for us to hear from our elders. And Ape Matioko, Tikiu Pramai, is going to share some of the traditional knowledge of the Cook Islanders with us.
Kia ora. Kia ora means in our language, long life to you all. I was born in the Cook Islands, and I speak, my mother tongue is Maori, and the second language is English, and the third language is Tahitian. I was invested with the Matayoko title in 1975, and in the same year I joined the Koutu Nui. And from there I was also elected as the chairman for a period. We come from the triangle of the Polynesian Triangle, and Hawaii in the north, which we call Hawaii-Kiruma. Our area, French Polynesian Rarotonga, is Hawaii. And the Waiki Pāmama is also Rapa Nui. We share the same language. Rapa Nui is Easter Island, and we have Waiki Toto, which is New Zealand. Our Creator gave humanity a beautiful world full of wonders, full of living things, animals, birds, minerals, fish and others, sea and water life, and of course us, the human race. The human race has advanced in technology and with it created byproducts, greenhouse gases. These greenhouse gas emissions are now causing the world to warm up, changing our weather patterns, melting the ice caps and raising sea levels. There are many low-lying countries and islands in the world which will in time be drowned by the rising sea levels. The Cook Islands have 15 islands divided into the Northern Cook Islands and the Southern Cook Islands. The Northern group consists of Penguin, Pukapuka, Nassau, Sawaro, Maniki, Rakan, and all are atolls with the highest point on most atolls that's less than 4 meters. The Southern Cook Islands consist of Rarotonga with high and low-lying areas, Aitutaki, which you saw on the board, Palmerston, Mundwe, and Taputea are all atolls, Mangaya high with inland swamp area, which are all low, Moke with 15 meters above sea level, and Achu high with swampy lands. There are thousands of beautiful islands and atolls in the Pacific Ocean and other oceans which will be drowned by rising sea levels, and with it, many thousands of people will have to be relocated to higher ground in other countries that will accept them. Languages, perhaps many cultures and artifacts will be lost in this transition, also with the resettling of people. Many animal and bird life will also vanish. With climate change, we can expect stronger cyclones, dry conditions, less rain, and many other climate changes. Climate change affects everyone. Greenhouse gas emissions surround the world. Natural process, volcanoes, deforestation, diesel and coal from power stations, transport fuels, agriculture, and emissions from fuel combustion waste. Growth of activities in the Cook Islands include electric generation with diesel and road transport, international shipping and international aviation, lubricant use, refrigeration, air conditions, and solvent use. But these are tiny in comparison to the rest of the world, and only relatively recent developments compared to the Western industrial world. Industrial countries which emit vast amounts of gases into the atmosphere must realize that the warming of our planet Earth is in their hands. What is now happening in the Pacific Ocean will sooner or later affect the big countries also. Global climate change and sea level rise will affect the Cook Islands physically and socially. Our country is vulnerable to the slightest climate change. The tropical cyclone season officially starts 1st of November and ends 30th of April. Considering that climate change is already affecting some Pacific islands like Tuvalu, which has seawater inundating the island, Kiribati, Marshall Islands and others. Some Tuvalu residents have been resettled on the island of Niue and in New Zealand. The big question now is, what is happening to our environment is very unpleasant. What are we leaving for our future generations? A planet of desolation or a future of hope? Recently, Papua New Guinea advised that 8 islands of 25 in the island chain of Manus of Papua New Guinea had become inundated by seawater and population relocated. Our forefathers had a system of conservation of the beach and sea frontages by planting trees that would withstand cyclones, storms, and sea surges. Trees along the beach frontages were rawi, meaning that they were not to be cut down. These trees bear the brunt of sea surges and wind during cyclones and thereby protecting the inland areas. Some of these trees were shaped by wind constantly blowing on them. Sadly, today, many of these trees have been cut down to make way for houses. Trees for shelter belts of orange plantations were also cut down. Earlier in our history, archaeological records show that the Great Road of Toi was the outer ring road of Rarotonga, this being at the foothills. Before Christianity arrived, our ancestors lived inland. The missionaries later brought our people down to flatlands. Our traditional knowledge of climate change totally varies. However, the following are: the banana leaves, when the youngest leaf emerges from the trunk twisted and curled up, this is a very good indication that a hurricane or cyclone would occur. Fruit trees, an unusually abundant crop of breadfruit, mangoes, avocados, also foretell of hurricane or cyclone. Crabs. When beach crabs start crawling inland and climb trees, this is a sign of approaching very high and rough seas, and perhaps approaching cyclone. The birds, the frigate birds, when they fly over land, indicate bad weather at sea. There are many other climate change indications in the Cook Islands, like on the island of Manaya, an abundant porcupine fish in the lagoons is regarded as a sign to foretell that a cyclone would occur. Plants' growth also foretells of drought ahead through the lack of luster in their leaves and trees. Even today, after good rainfall, the topsoil dries up within 3 to 4 days. The Koutu Nui has set up a Rawi system to isolate or set aside various areas of our lagoon for the protection of fish, trochus shells, and other sea life. This was introduced about 10 years ago and is proving to be successful. Previously, the government tried to set up the Rawi system, but they weren't very successful with it, so the Koutu Nui took it on. This is an area where we set aside about 100 to 300 meters of the lagoon, so that the fish stock can replenish themselves. Sometimes it's left closed for 1 to 2 years, and then it's opened usually about December, January, so they can fish the lagoons, and then it's closed again. It is interesting also to note that the Cook Islands have approximately 2 million square miles of ocean and only 240 hectares of land. All our economic zones merge with other countries around us. And right in the center is the only international part where outsiders can come and fish. But to get a fishing license, and of course you have to apply for fishing license to various countries surrounding the area. But we do have the poachers coming in to fish in the international side. The sea level rise is of great concern to every nation and its people. The question again is, what are we leaving for our future generations? Christianity arrived in the Cook Islands in 1821, Aitutaki being the first, then around the southern group, and then Rarotonga in 1823. The missionaries set up their stations, and also they got rid of most of our wooden idols by burning them. However, they did not burn them all, they took some to England. These later became high-priced articles and fetched high prices. The missionaries changed the way of the lifestyle of the Cook Islands in many, many ways. The land was surveyed between 1903 and 1907. All land of titles and the families' names are listed on all the titles that the land belongs to. It is interesting to note that the paramount chief Maclear heard that the French from Tahiti was coming to Rarotonga. So they hastily sewed the Union Jack and hoisted up because they did not want the French to go to Rarotonga. The Cook Islands became a British protectorate late in the 1890s, and later became a New Zealand under New Zealand administration. In August 1965, the Cook Islands became self-governing. The then Premier of the Cook Islands noted that the paramount chiefs was not included in the Cook Islands Constitution. So the Constitution was rectified to include the paramount chiefs. So that is why we now have a House of Origi. In 1972, the Constitution was again rectified to include the Koutu Nui. This house consists of the Matayapos, Rangatiras, Kabanas, and Taumas. Of interest, the Rangatiras cannot become a chairperson of the Koutu Nui. When anyone in the family requires a piece of land, the family meeting is called to ask for a piece, and a quorum is required by asking the landowners for a piece. Usually they give you a quarter acre. The same applies to for leases. But the lease, to lease a piece of property, the family still have to agree to it. But in that case, the family meets in the courthouse and it's conducted by a staff member of the court. Rarotonga, the lands in the Cook Islands cannot be sold. There are 3 islands in the Cook Islands. That's Micharo, Manaya, and Pukapuka. They do not have a court system. The chiefs do their own passing out of the land. And of course, land cannot be sold, so that's how we stand with our land at present. And I'd like to say by the title of The Shifting Tides is appropriate heading for this because the tides are surely changing. Kia ora.
Our next presenter is a friend of the university, Mr. Larry Grant from the Musqueam First Nation. And he is going to share some of his personal observations of climate change here.
My name is Larry Grant. I come from the Musqueam people, and my community is about 5 or 6 kilometers eastward on Marine Drive. And a majority of that community that's left for our people to live on is approximately 2 meters above the high water mark. So that's just where we are. My personal observations and recollections of climate change, I've been told by my family that the climate is changing, and these changes may have dire consequences on our way of life. Around the time of my birth, a little over 70 years ago, the Fraser River had frozen over up at Koutu, which is in southwest Minster. It's one of our upriver villages. And that river is always flowing, and there's a significant current there, so that it was something to have that river freeze over, to be able to withstand people walking across it and animals walking across it, and that has never happened again. But in 1969, there were some ice floes coming down the river, and they basically collected at Westminster again. So that year, Beaver Lake froze over, and it allowed for public ice skating. And also, in my youth, there were some years that Lost Lagoon would freeze over hard enough to allow public skating, and that's never happened again. So that was in the last 3 decades. And the changes in the forest that I've noticed, there's a pine beetle infestation in the interior of British Columbia that I saw happening in the early 1970s. There were little patches of red needle pine trees, that indicated that these trees were dead from pine beetle infestation. This has grown enormously, spreading from the West Chilcotin all the way across British Columbia, over the Rocky Mountains and now into Alberta. There's only two ways that you can control that. And that natural control is by a rapid decline in temperature down to approximately minus 20 degrees. And that has to happen almost overnight and has to be maintained for several weeks to prevent the beetle from naturally producing an antifreeze in the body to prevent it from dying. And the other is by fire, either natural fires or by set controlled fires that will kill off the beetle. But that hasn't happened because of the forestry industry wanting to preserve the lumber for commercial ventures. And the fire does two things. It gets rid of the beetle, and also it helps to regenerate the pine trees, which the pine cone needs to heat to open up and allow the seed to drop to the ground to be regenerated. And this also has an effect on the salmon population because the forest is dead in the drainage area of the Fraser River, and it doesn't have any nutrients to supply to the fish populations that use those areas for spawning areas. And the forest also is not there to absorb what carbon it can absorb. So that's a big change I've seen. And in the Oolican harvest, our community used to harvest Oolican in front of the reserve. And as young children, we used to be able to go out in the mud flats and collect the Oolican that had spent themselves while they were spawning. And we could harvest them in the eelgrass down there. And we would use all of that Oolican. My aunt and my mother and my grandmother would prepare thousands and thousands of those Oolican for food. And that happened. Most other families would do that also. And now the returning runs have diminished drastically so that this kind of harvesting in front of the community is not able to happen. And there are several reasons for that. One is there's a significant bycatch in the shrimp tom in the mid-ocean. And the other is habitat destruction. The dredging of the river changes the flow of the river and affects the spawning area. And there's climate change. The change which sees an earlier onset of the spring warming and melting the snowpacks and more rain happening, changing the flow of the river where there's a heavier flow coming down and affecting and disrupting the spawning areas of the Oolican. The socio-economics of the change. One is the economic change. The return of the salmon has diminished in a way that has not been conducive to more accurately or reliably extrapolate the number of returning salmon for better management of harvesting of the salmon. And many of the habitats have been destroyed. Some have been repaired, replaced, or recreated. And the ones that are created have been, seem to be showpieces for the public and not really for rehabilitation of salmon stock. Because in Vancouver alone, there are approximately, there are over 40 salmon streams either buried or put into culverts, destroying the natural habitat of the greater Vancouver regional area. And this salmon supplied our community with over 80% of the protein that we've traditionally used. And modern Western industrial society, not knowing or possibly not really caring, has not maintained the balance between keystone species and predator species creating an imbalance in how interdependent Mother Earth is. And this in turn reflects the imbalance of land resources as part of the habitat and climate change that help to deplete our sea life. And the southern boundary of the salmon return seems to be moving northward, and it seems to be at the boundary of Canada and the United States now rather than further south. And with that change comes a social climate change. There's also a social climate change that happens. This brings us to the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy that was in response to the Supreme Court of Canada decision recognizing that there's an Aboriginal right to fish. The Department of Fisheries is an options created Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy for the Aboriginal. And in the early years of that agreement, there were over 1 million salmon unaccounted for at the spawning grounds. And the first analysis of this was that the fish succumbed to extreme water temperatures in the river or poached by someone. And the subsequent reports say that the water temperatures were not extreme enough to kill the fish, even though low water levels create the situation for warmer water and for in-river mortality. And the fish eggs are not able to really hatch in warmer waters, warmer than normal. And with that, the Fisheries Survival Coalition, which represents the fishers, the commercial sector, used that situation to publicly declare and brand Aboriginals as the poachers of the missing salmon, not caring that poaching is carried on by most sectors of society, thus creating a misconception of immorality in Aboriginal people of Canada and perpetuating a negative stereotype of Aboriginals. The climate changes seem to have given to greater wind forces and rainstorms that last year blew down over 1,000 trees in Stanley Park. And the rainstorms resulted in landslides that destroyed homes and taken people's lives. When the rain comes down hard for more than 3 days, the sewage containment facility at Annis's Island will overflow primary treated sewage into the river upstream from Muskrat. And when long, hot, dry spells occur, the sewage containment plant at Iona Island, directly across the river from Muskrat, will percolate and give off terrible odors affecting the people of Vancouver Southlands. And also, when there's more heavy rainfall, more toxins are leached from agriculture, industry, and urbanization, polluting the environment of the sea life. And the rising sea will allow raw sewage from the Greater Vancouver Region District to overflow and contaminate around the city because the tidal movement backs up approximately 30 kilometers upriver, and the sewage is pumped right out into the Gulf of Georgia. So with the rising sea waters, all of the sea walls will be under the top level of the high water. And in closing, the question I ask is this climate change, which is exacerbated by man, or is this nature's cyclical climate pendulum swing, and when or will it ever swing back naturally? Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Our final presenter on our panel is Ms. Shauna Morgan, and Shauna is Cree from Saskatchewan in northern Quebec, and she's a senior manager for the Centre for Indigenous Environmental Resources, which is an organization based in Winnipeg.
Stephanie. Good morning, everyone. As Stephanie said, my name is Shauna Morgan, and I'm Cree, but I have an Anishinaabe name as well, and that's Anamaki Gabi Dewiton, which means they're coming under the clouds. A little bit about SEER. We're a not-for-profit, non-governmental organization located in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and we've been around for about 14 years now, and I've been working with them for the past 7 years. And at SEER, our mission is to assist First Nations to build capacity so that they can deal with their own environmental issues. And a little bit more about myself. Stephanie mentioned my First Nation is Waskaganish Cree Nation, which is located on the southern shores of James Bay on the Quebec side. And I have a master's degree in botany, which I got from the University of Manitoba. But for the past 7 years, I've been working as an environmental scientist across Canada with SEER. So we come from opposite ends of the earth, the Cook Islands and Canada. Yet First Nations in Canada and the Cook Islands are connected as we produce fewer greenhouse gases than wealthier groups of people, and we will experience greater climate change impacts because we have less capacity to adapt to the changes of a warming climate, mainly because we have fewer people and we have less money. So I come to you to share my experiences in taking action on climate change, the ways that we've engaged, educated, and enabled First Nations in Canada to participate in the processes and to assist in planning on how to adapt to our rapidly changing climate. For those of you that are not familiar with the Indigenous communities of Canada, there's more than 900 Indigenous communities, Inuit, Métis, and First Nations. And many of our communities have lower human development indicators, lower per capita incomes, shorter life expectancy, and greater infant mortality. Also, many of our communities, 130 of them, are not connected to the electrical grid, and that means that they have to use diesel energy to produce electricity. And this is costly both environmentally and financially. As we all know, the cost of oil continues to rise, and this is something that is putting our First Nation communities that rely on diesel generation in jeopardy because of those rising costs. Secondly, it's also very costly environmentally. One First Nation that we've worked with in northern Manitoba had a diesel spill, and it was the energy provider in our province that spilled diesel. But it's costing Indian and Northern Affairs somewhere between $5 and $10 million to clean up that spill. And so, you know, there's a great need for us to get off diesel energy. Furthermore, the cost to the individual is much greater as well. In southern Manitoba, we pay approximately 7 cents per kilowatt hour, but in northern communities, you can pay as much as $1.05 per kilowatt hour. So it's very difficult to have an economic base when you have to pay so much money for electricity. And finally, there's substandard service if you're on diesel generation. Generally, you have about 60 amp service, and in southern Canada, we have 200 amp service. So that means if you're a busy mother, you can come home, be cooking a meal, have the refrigerator plugged in, doing some laundry, and the kids are watching TV. Whereas for instance, northern Manitoba, if you're on diesel generation, that's not possible because you can only operate a limited number of appliances. So we know climate change is happening, but what is it that leaders can do? These changes disproportionately affect Indigenous communities due to their close association with the environment and greater levels of poverty. How do we create opportunities for Indigenous communities to help themselves? For the past 5 years, SEER's climate change work with First Nations has moved from public education and outreach to climate-centered, comprehensive community planning tools. Presented today are the projects, tools, and lessons learned to inform others on the importance of working with Indigenous communities to generate community-driven solutions. Specifically, we suggest a multi-pronged approach. engaging, educating, and enabling communities to create comprehensive community plans. Such plans allow for effective climate change mitigation and adaptation actions while addressing similarly aligned community priorities. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with Deborah Harford at the Simon Fraser University, she's leading an organization, or what they are calling a team of people, Adaptation to Climate Change Team. So just thought I'd give a plug for that organization. So with the communities we've worked with, we found that you must provide them with the knowledge, skills, and resources to help themselves. And the main reason for this is that individual behavior affects energy efficiency and the operation of equipment infrastructure, maintenance, equipment, infrastructure, operations, and maintenance. And some of the things that we've done at SEER are to generate posters such as this poster that is culturally appropriate, and it reflects the culture as well, the individual here. And just to promote behavior that is very energy efficient. And we do have a radio ad that we involved youth with as well to create, but unfortunately the speakers here won't allow everyone to hear it, so I'm not going to play it today. Secondly, what we did was to have community energy baselines completed, and that helps the communities to know what energy is coming into the community, whether that's from diesel energy, hydroelectric energy, wood energy, or even gasoline for cars. And then show how that energy is used in the community, and then the different emissions that are generated from those types of energy, and the annual cost. And these were assessments of the largest buildings and a sampling of the houses in the community to identify the best opportunities to make the buildings and homes more energy efficient. Secondly, we must help communities to identify and prioritize climate change impacts affecting them and their environment. And this is because the members are the ones that live in close association with the environment and know which impacts will have the greatest effect on them. And one of the projects that we worked on here was a video called Signals from the Forest, where we were working with First Nations delivering a climate change workshop, and we documented some of their observations of climate change. And some of the ones that were very dramatic were changes to the glaciers that are melting. Glaciers sometimes will melt up to 1 meter per day, but in northern BC they're noticing that this is happening more frequently than it used to in the past. Another project that we worked on was the Lake Winnipeg fishing study, where we worked with fishers that both fish for subsistence and for commercial purposes. And one of the most shocking impacts that we saw there that we wouldn't have known about if we weren't working with the local people was the change in the decrease in the amount of time that storms approach. Previously, the fishers told us that when they saw a storm on the horizon, they had about 30 minutes to clear their nets of fish, pull their nets up, and get to safe harbor. But now they've said that time has been reduced to about 15 minutes, and this has resulted in a loss of the catch that they had in those nets, a loss of nets which cost them hundreds of dollars, and in few instances it's resulted in the loss of fishers' lives as well. So it's a very serious impact for them. And finally, we've done some studies on winter roads, which are essential for getting building supplies, food, and fuel into remote northern communities. And with warmer, shorter winters, this is having an impact on the length of time that those roads can be opened. And in a few extreme cases, the roads aren't even being constructed because the time is so short now, they can't get it in, which results in the costly flying in of diesel fuel. Communities must also identify, prioritize, and implement mitigation and adaptation initiatives. Community consensus is possible on their priority issues if everyone in the community is involved in identifying what the best mitigation and adaptation opportunities are. Furthermore, you can build on the strengths, the existing strengths in communities. If there's particularly good health programs or economic development programs that are in place, these can be integrated, and mitigation and adaptation activities can be centered around these. Furthermore, it allows communities to choose the options that have the greatest benefit to them, whether that's increased jobs or increased economic development opportunities for individuals in the community. Furthermore, members can support measures that they help choose. And in one instance, we worked with First Nation who was interested to figure out if they had enough wind resource to generate electricity and build this in as an economic development opportunity where they could then sell electricity back to the grid. And so they had to set up a wind monitoring tower. And because they were only going to be setting up one, they needed to find the highest point in their community to set it up. And they found this nice hill, and they said, oh, this is great. This is our windiest spot in our community. Let's put it here. But one of the people that we were working with, the local person, said, you know what, we better check it out with the elders first and talk to them. So they went to talk to their elders, and sure enough, the elder told them, no, you can't put that wind monitoring tower there. That's actually an ancient burial mound, and you have to stay away from there. And so then the community was able to choose another location. With limited resources, it's important that communities meet multiple goals with every initiative. And the way that they can do this is through comprehensive community planning, so that they can have a very efficient use of resources. For instance, again, mitigation and adaptation activities will often save money as well, such as driving less and walking more. So in this case, it could save the individual's money, but we all know that diabetes and heart disease are rampant among our Indigenous communities as well. And this could also be part of a health initiative. One of the projects that we worked on here was to create a series of 6 guidebooks that walk communities through the comprehensive community planning process. And we also built in questions that allow community members to consider how climate change is affecting them. And so these guidebooks are available on our website at seer.ca. And these books together allow communities to coordinate activities so that they can achieve the long-term vision of economic, social, environmental, and cultural priorities. So climate change is an imminent threat to Indigenous communities around the world. Many Indigenous communities continue to rely on streams and lakes for water, fish, and lands for traditional foods from plants and animals. In the video, Signals from the Forest, a young man tells about giving back to the earth, whatever you have, because they're keeping you alive. The idea that food and water only come from a store is a foreign one in many Indigenous communities, but it's more than that. There's a spiritual connection that's revealed in the languages, histories, beliefs, and values of the Indigenous people. And acknowledgement and respect for these are paid, and they're quite literally paid back to the land and water, plants and animals for the gifts that they give. Every community, every nation out there, every Indigenous nation out there is unique because they're intimately connected with the lands and waters that support them. And unique communities require unique solutions. So long-term change to address inequities and address climate change requires empowering Indigenous communities to help themselves. And in each of the communities that I've worked with over the past 5 years on climate change, one thing has come to the fore in every single community. Even though I say, the amount of greenhouse gases that are produced per capita by individuals in this community is very small compared to others in wealthier communities farther south. But they always want to know what is it they can do to help. And I have a slide that goes over that, but I'll just tell you those things. First of all, I tell people that they can reduce reliance on their car, and this allows them to spend less money on gas. And in larger communities such as Vancouver, use public transit. And you know, if you're using it only once in a while, challenge yourself to use it once a week. The second biggest thing, besides transportation for Canadians, is home heating and cooling. And just adjusting your thermostat, reducing it in the heating months by a degree or two will save a lot of energy, and also insulating your home better. I think one of the most important things we can do is to continue to identify environmental concerns to our governments, whether those are municipal governments, provincial governments, or federal governments, because each individual's voice matters here, and we need to make sure that this is a priority for our governments. And finally, the greatest way we can have an effect on climate change is by what we spend our money on. Send a message to corporations out there. Buy local, buy organic. Those are two ways that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, invest in corporations that care. We all are thinking about our own retirements as well, and do that extra work that it takes to figure out which corporations have good environmental policies out there and are concerned about reducing their impacts as well. We wish.